Hey everybody, it's JJ, and today I wanted to do a quick walkthrough. Well, we'll see if it's quick. I want to do a walkthrough of wireless security architecture. So this is the book, my recent book that was just published with Wiley, and it's just started shipping a few weeks ago. So the full title, Wireless Security Architecture, Designing and Maintaining Secure Wireless for Enterprise. So my friend called it a tome. It is quite a large book, but it's pretty comprehensive, and it does cover several different disciplines. So it covers security architecture from an information security and risk management standpoint. It gets into the network security architecture and planning for that, and then overlays Wi-Fi security with that. And then we get into some of the non-Wi-Fi wireless as well. So what I want to do is just share the contents at a glance. So the book is organized into the main part of the book is organized into three parts in 8 chapters. And don't worry if you can't read the chapter numbers. I'm going to walk you through a few key points of each of these things. So what I'm going to do is this is the high level overview of the contents by chapter, and I'm going to go pick out a few things from each chapter that I think are kind of interesting that you should maybe want to check out. So in chapter 1, and actually let me just skip and let's just get into the good stuff. So getting into chapter 1 is really the introduction to concepts and relationships. And here's where I'm kind of level setting with language and the relationships of different disciplines related to security architecture in an enterprise. So, the people, the roles, risk management, compliance, and what that means specifically to security architecture and network and security architects that are planning secure Wi-Fi. So we talk about integrity, availability, and confidentiality, but we talk about that specifically as it relates to a wireless implementation. We also get into a high level, really 10,000 foot view of some of the concepts like segmentation, authentication, and then some of the Wi-Fi specific technical concepts where we're talking about protocols, a brief introduction to the three types of security profiles we have in SSIDs, the relationships of endpoint devices and network topology. And again, everything in chapter 1 is very 10,000 foot view, but it is designed to kind of get us all level set and on the same page and same vernacular as we move into the more technical conversations. And so in the world of information security and risk management, we have our own language there. In the world of network architecture, of course, we have our own language there. And in the world of Wi-Fi, we have our own language there. If you're reading a Wi-Fi standard, you will see things like STA for station, which could be an endpoint. It could be an AP. And so when you're reading that and you don't work and live in that world, it can get pretty confusing quickly. You get kind of twisted around and then you spend more time, trying to remember, did that mean this? Did that mean this? Or could it mean either thing? And so in chapter 1, I'm really just level setting all of that language and getting us set for getting into chapter 2, which dives into those more technical concepts that were introduced in chapter 1. So there's not a lot of overlap there. The book really is designed to be read, starting at the beginning and all the way through. But there are kind of backwards references if you get into, chapter 2 or 3. And there was foundation laid earlier. You'll get some references back to that. I tried to do that without being repetitive, just because if you are reading the book straight through, it just gets to be annoying. So when we get into chapter 2, we're talking about the different architectures. So controller architecture, cloud managed architectures for Wi-Fi specifically, how that impacts the data paths, the control plane, the management plane, and how that all ties into the security architecture and planning for that. And then we get into the more technical part of the conversation with those different security profiles. So we're really diving into the new WPA3 standard, the differences between WPA2 and 3, and that's different for an enterprise 802.1x network than it is for a personal or passphrase-based network. The feature sets are different, like what we bring to the table with WPA3 varies, and the recommendations of migrating from WPA2 to 3 vary. So all of that's covered there, along with some little bit deeper dives into untangling what's in WPA3. So, the Wi-Fi architects especially, you can kind of geek out a little bit there. We go pretty deep. And thanks to Stephen Orr for a lot of that information. So the 802.11 standard, where all of this is wrapped into, including the security, is I think over 4,000 pages. So and he has access to information that none of the rest of us do. So it was great to be able to get access to that and to be able to pick out some things from that standard and put some tables and information together to save you guys from doing that. So in chapter 3, it's really everything related to authentication and authorization. And so that is Radius, it's 802.1x, it's EAP, it's everything you wanted to know, and then 50 million things you didn't want to know necessarily. It is focused on Wi-Fi. Well, I should say it's focused on wireless with a strong preference for Wi-Fi. A few things I might have thrown in there related to if you're going to do this on a wired network or if you're going to do this X, Y, and Z. But instead of giving you, everything related to these standards, it's really very focused on what are we doing in enterprise networks now, what are we going to be doing in the future, and focusing on those segments of the technologies instead of trying to cover everything that you'll probably never need to know or use. So very actionable there. We get into everything related to Radius servers. So there's doesn't matter what Radius server you have. There's content in here with standard Radius attributes. We get into vendor-specific attributes and explain those, when to use what, why, how. We talk about Cisco ICE. I talk about ClearPass. I talk about Free Radius. I talk about Microsoft NPS. I'm sure I talk about other stuff in there too. Trying to hit on everything you guys might have had your hands on, just for some, common references to what that might look like. So then we get into the EAP methods. And this book is organized into outer EAP methods and tunnels, and then the inner authentication and the relationship between those. So when and why to pair them, why to have an outer tunnel, how that adds security, even if you're using TLS certificates for endpoints, why you want to do that tunneled inside of something else. There is a little bit of nitty-gritty technical juicy detail in securing those tunnels, and some explanations for very high security environments about which ones are incrementally more secure and why. And then we get into, so there's a nice little EAP method recommendation, a little kind of cheat sheet table there for you if you want to skip the rest of it. So then I address everything related to Mac-based identification and authentication, and specifically kind of talk about why Mac authentication isn't actually authentication from an information security standpoint. A little bit of a misnomer, but it is a common phrase. So we talk about Mac authentication bypass quite a bit here. The security considerations for Mac authentication bypass. This does, I know it's the easy button. It's kind of what a lot of organizations and vendors do in implementation. It does introduce a lot of security risk into the environment. And so we talk about that and why and how. And if you are going to use MAB or something based on a MAC address, kind of address how to do that the most secure way you can, when and why and how you want to separate that from the rest of your environment, so you don't put your highly secured 802.1x network endpoints, data, applications at risk from MAC authentication bypass. And then I cover everything related to certificates. So we've got certificates for 802.1x, server side, client side, some fun stuff with self-enrollment and how to automate some of that. We get into certificates for captive portals, and then there's best practices, when to use what types of certificates for which type of use cases, and why, and what extra work is required if you do it differently. And then there's more information on captive portal security and some best practices there. And then hidden down here is this little gem. We get into the 4-way handshake here. So in Wi-Fi, and this is specific to Wi-Fi, there's this 4-way handshake that is the foundational, fundamental first thing that happens with all of this operation for 802.11. And so it's very fundamental as we get into architecture conversations specifically for security because of the key exchanges and roaming support. And so you kind of have to understand this for the next section in chapter 4 for that to make sense. So it's not long. It's what, looks like 3 pages there. Definitely check that out though if you don't read anything else in this chapter. So getting into chapter 4, we're talking about 2 different things here, really. We're talking about how the wired network and domain infrastructure services can impact your wireless security, but also how Wi-Fi design that's not necessarily security specific directly impacts security. And that kind of goes back to these fast roaming technologies, and the various roaming protocols and the key exchanges that happen. And so, I don't want to spoil it for you, but there's when we're roaming with an endpoint between access points. If we have a secured connection with keys through 802.1x, what we're trying to do is minimize that round trip traffic, and cut that down so that there's less latency. Because unfortunately, right now, and I hope this changes, if you look at some of the recommendations for security, including from NIST, for, I'm going to make an example, biomedical devices, a lot of their documentation says to use a passphrase-based, secured network instead of 802.1x. And that's just one example. So when you get into things like push to talk and voice over IP, voice over Wi-Fi communications, a lot of times the organizations, the vendors and or the infrastructure vendors like your Wi-Fi vendor and the vendor of that application or those devices that you're connecting on those networks may suggest you use passphrase-based networks, simply because if the wireless infrastructure isn't designed properly, the fast, secure roaming protocol won't work. And that introduces latency that's just not acceptable for that type of application or that data. So this whole section here, starting where we're talking about understanding Wi-Fi design impacts on security, this is all very important. I hope everybody kind of peeks at that. So chapter 5 is the planning and design chapter. So this is the before you touch anything chapter. And it's the last part of that before you implement. And so this walks through my personal design methodology. It's 5 phases in 3 different stages. And so it explains kind of my thought process of, the past 20 so years of working with customers, and helping them make smart security decisions, based on a lot of different inputs. And so there's even a chart in here that shows like a long list of inputs as it relates to pieces of information or properties of the network, properties of the risk profile, properties of the applications, et cetera, and how that impacts the different design considerations. So pretty large diagram there. And this isn't meant to be a giant long list of things you're going to ask somebody. Some of these, again, this book covers organizations of all sizes and industries, from kind of smaller mid-sized organizations. The cutoff really for me in my head is if an organization has a managed switches, then this book is appropriate. If they don't, if it's an SMB and they don't have managed switches, there's pieces of this book that are appropriate. But certainly, anybody that has a managed switch all the way up into some of the largest networks in the world, this applies to them. And so some of these questions are, I don't want to say, industry specific, but there are definitely some you're just going to skip and say that's not really applicable here because of size or because of risk or because of whatever. But it is kind of the thought process, as somebody who's worked with a lot of different organizations over the years, these are the different thought processes I'm going through and a lot of my peers go through while we're designing this architecture and making it secure. So everything from the teams to the endpoints, the policies, the data paths. So then we get into the correlating of inputs and outputs. And in this chapter, what you will see in the book embedded are some different planning templates. So there's an SSID planner that I use that captures kind of all of the network elements as well as the security profiles for one or more SSIDs. And that's appropriate for controller or cloud-based architectures. And then we get into access rights planning. So there's two kind of models here. There's a simplified, I probably should have put the simplified one at the beginning, but there's a simplified access rights planner down here that's kind of a basic one. And then you get into this kind of more detailed like NAC-like or role-based access planner. There's a couple of examples of those there. I'm also going to take those in like Word and Excel documents or PDFs and put them on the blog site at securityuncorked.com so that you can download them and modify them and use them from there. And then one of my favorite parts of the book, I hope you guys enjoy this. And in fact, I felt so strongly about this section here, notes for technical and executive leadership. So really, probably if you're reading this book, this section's not written for you to read, but it is written for you to take to your management team or your stakeholders for projects and sort of use this as a tool to advocate for your needs. So, helping to educate those non-technical audiences on some of the things, because, some of the perception from a CIO, CTO, CISO is opposite of what we may know as a network or wireless architect. And so this is designed for you to use as a tool. And I did talk to Wiley, and we've, gotten permission. I have permission now to pull this piece out and put this in a PDF as an excerpt of the book, and make this whole section available to share with the world. So that will be coming in the next few weeks. And then chapter 6 gets into hardening the wireless infrastructure. And I have to tell you guys, I wrote this book pretty quickly because I had it all kind of in my head ready to go, and it was just a matter of typing it and organizing it. But this chapter just about kicked my butt because I knew what we needed to do from hardening, but to me it wasn't helpful if I gave you what to do, but you couldn't figure out how to do it on the different platforms. And I've worked with a lot of different wireless platforms over the years, like probably 12, 15, maybe more, in the past 20 years or so. And so I felt like, well, they should be pretty easy to find. I think I know the words to look for, but what I found out was, no, like Cisco calls it something, and then Aruba calls it something else. So when there are things that are not clear, like if you can't just Google what's in here in the book under a certain heading, with, plus your manufacturer of choice, then what I did is did that research, reached out to some friends that were specialists on different platforms, and tried to at least send you down the right direction, because a lot of these manufacturers, the documentation for their products, sometimes just for the controller, like let's say it's a controller architecture, and I'm not picking on any one of them, it's all of them. Just the controller documentation is often like 1,500 pages, 2,000 plus pages, and doesn't necessarily cover the hardening along with some other stuff I want to cover in monitoring. And so, if I couldn't find it easily, I did go ahead and make a sidebar, understanding, please forgive me if it changes from version to version a little bit. That's going to happen over the life of this book. But at least if hey, let me look for Cisco in this phrase, and that's what it was in the prior version, now you know what to ask for from your SE for the new version. So at least sends you in the right direction. So yes, that part might get outdated. It did take me a very long time to research all of that. Probably read 5,500 to 6,000 pages of different vendor documentation, just to put this together just to put the how do you do it with that vendor together. So I hope you guys enjoy that. That's the hardening section. And then there are tiered recommendations somewhere in here. There are some tiered recommendations for hardening because, again, this is written for a broad audience in terms of levels of professional skills, the teams and resources. If an organization it's not of the size that has, strict change management and entire teams to manage stuff, there's some things in here that are just not appropriate for a smaller organization or a smaller team to do. And so, don't shoot yourself in the foot. There's tiered guidance here of, this is the bare minimum. I don't care who you are. This is the bare minimum you should do. And then there are kind of 2 more levels up from that. So bare minimum, mid-level, appropriate for most organizations, and then sort of this higher level of hardening for stuff like federal agencies, banks, financial organizations, things like that. So that's all in here. We also cover the protected management frames, what that means, how that impacts your architecture there. And then there's this little section here where we talk about peer-to-peer communications. And I'm going to specifically call out this section where we talk about filtering interstation traffic, multicast, and MDNS. So all of the zero conf or zero configuration networking protocols that are designed for kind of home, residential consumer use, things like the Bonjour protocol, which is, it's an Apple's protocol of MDNS, but a lot of different things use it. It's not just an Apple products. And so we talk about like why why and how those introduce vulnerabilities into the network, how to mitigate some of that, and just kind of level set with those things. And then we get into chapter 7, which is the monitoring maintenance. So this is your ongoing kind of care and feeding of the network. What's fun here is I do kind of talk through for the network architects and wireless architects and admins. If you're not familiar with it, I kind of explained to you the different types of testing and assessments going to happen related to sometimes just assessments and sometimes as part of an audit for a compliance requirement and what that means. And then we get into some of the specific tools, when those are appropriate, what are some examples, how to use those. And then probably the other fun part is this section on logging, alerting, and reporting best practices. So I call out very specific things from a logging perspective. So let me start with alerting. What do you need to know about right now? What do you need to alert on? What do you need to log to have reference for later? So maybe you need something for incident response for security later. And then what's good for reporting for kind of long-term trending analysis. So that's covered here. And then we get into a little bit of troubleshooting and some other resources. And then I mentioned chapter 8. This is where all of the information that will not persist for 5 years, it's going to change drastically in the next 5 years. This is all kind of down here. So we've got remote workforce. We have some specific recommendations and best practices there. The BYOD section, which covers not just strict BYOD, but all of the other ownership and management models. So BYOD is bring your own device. That's this is Jen's personal phone. I'm going to access some corporate resources on it somehow. I have brought my own device. There's also, choose your own device, where the organization maybe gives me a choice and maybe they purchase the device for me, but I pick out of a list of maybe 3 to 5 devices. And they may own it and partially manage it, or I might own it and they might partially manage it. And then there's corporate owned, personally enabled, COPE. So there's all of these different models for BYOD. So I kind of talk about that there. And then getting into both the technical considerations and recommendations for that, as well as the legal considerations, because one of the big things we're dealing with right now is there are a lot of legal considerations for BYOD. It's not something that's appropriate for the network architect or really even the security architect or the wireless architect to make that decision. This is a business level decision. It should involve the stakeholders and lawyers. And so I talk about what those considerations are as well. And then we talk about some zero trust, IoT, and then we get into enterprise IoT and non-Wi-Fi wireless. So all of the other flavors of wireless connectivity we might use in the enterprise that are not Wi-Fi, including things like private cellular, the different private WANs, public cellular for IoT connections, and all of the different Bluetooth, BLE, and automation technologies there. Appendix A gets into configuring NPS in the lab if you're going to use that for Radius server, some walkthroughs and specific settings there to look at. Appendix B is just some additional resources. Appendix C is that juicy sample architecture section. So if you don't want to read the rest of the book, just jump here. It's going to give you some place to start. And this is divided into architectures for internal access networks and then architectures for guest or internet only networks. And the architectures for internal access networks, because we're talking about Wi-Fi or enterprise connected networks, my assumption here and my recommendations here are very focused on internal resources, primarily kind of on-prem and that type of authorization, not things like remote user cloud-based asset where we have ZTNA type of technologies, because if you're connected to the enterprise Wi-Fi, you were there. So that covers all of that, and it breaks it down into, is it a managed user and a managed endpoint? Is it a BYOD device? Is it a contractor, et cetera, et cetera. And then the same thing for internet only. And then just some parting thoughts in Appendix D. So I hope that helps explain what's in the book. I hope it's of interest to you. I'd love feedback if you do go grab this. Love to hear what you think about it. Obviously love an Amazon review. Feel free to reach out to me directly, and do continue watching securityuncorked.com for more content from the book. Thanks, everybody.